And here we go. We're going to begin this may be the last lecture I give on Descartes' meditations this semester. I don't want to make any promises. We may have to carry some of this material over into one more lecture. Regardless, we will definitely be talking about Descartes and transitioning to some other philosophers and eventually getting to Sartre next class this coming Thursday at 1 p.m. If you can make it, you're definitely invited. But as I said, today is meditation 5, meditation 6, however much we can get through that. Meditation 5 is actually quite brief, so I don't see it taking us that long. The title of it, Concerning the Essence of Material Things, and again concerning God, that he exists. So we get another proof for God's existence. We covered the first one from meditation 3 a while back. Now he's going to provide us with yet another proof for the existence of a divine, perfect, infinite, all-knowing, all-powerful, creator of all things being. But really, you might even say, and I mean, maybe I'm being a bit harsh on Descartes here, that this title is a bit of an oversell. He says that he's going to talk about the essence of material things. And honestly, to me, I don't really think we get much about material things in this meditation, besides the fact that the geometrical properties of them, he doesn't come out explicitly and say that, but he kind of implies that the geometrical properties of things are essential to them. And he doesn't even really ever get to a proof in meditation 5 that material things even exist independently of my mind. And you're not really going to get that until meditation 6. And I hope we can get to that today. We might not. It might take us a while to get through this proof for God's existence and his contemplation of the geometrical properties of what he takes to be material things, or corporeal substances, as he sometimes refers to them. Before I dive in and start reading quotes and analyzing the reading, let's back up a bit and sort of remind ourselves of this sort of problem and why I'm sort of telling you that the title sort of oversells you on what's going to go on here, because the issue still, at least if we are following Descartes, apparently we still haven't proven that objects exist apart from our mind. We know that we have experiences, and we know that we're not being deceived all the time, but we know that sometimes we're deceived. We talked about that last time. We sometimes make errors because we have free will, and that's a good thing, but it also makes us capable of bad things, so that's the price we pay. But Descartes still seems to think that we haven't really established that the things that we see in the world out there are, one, as they appear, or two, even out there at all. Why do I think that when I experience there being a tree in the world, that there actually is a tree in the world? Maybe it's all just in my mind. Descartes doesn't want to believe that hypothesis. He wants to believe, we're going to see later, a much more commonsensical view that, yes, things do exist independent of me. There are external objects out there that are causing my senses to see them, and they do have properties that more or less cohere with my experience, as long as I understand and analyze that experience with my reason and understand it mathematically. And I don't go with my initial experience through my senses, but through reflection and understanding and reason, I arrive at truth. Just like the example he gave of the sun. I have this one, what he calls an idea of the sun. I prefer the word experience. I have an experience of the sun. He's like, I have an idea of the sun whereby the sun appears much closer than it actually is, whereby the sun appears much smaller than it is. This idea I arrived at through my senses. But this other idea that I arrived at through mathematical, astronomical reasoning, as he calls it, where I realized the sun is actually much larger than the earth and very far away. This is actually true to the real sun, the actual sun, the thing in itself, as these philosophers sometimes refer to the object? What is the thing in itself? And how do I know that my experience is anything like the actual thing in itself? These are all questions that he leaves open, but he makes you think he might get on to answering them just by reading the title here of the fifth meditation. Well, let's read I have this quote here. I've got it marked on page 42 if you have this edition. It's just below paragraph 64. If you have an edition that has the numbering and the margins, you can just look for that 64. And it's right below the 64. It's a paragraph at the bottom of the page where he says, what I believe must be considered above all here is the fact that I find within me countless ideas of certain things that, even if perhaps they do not exist anywhere outside me, they still cannot said to be nothing. So there are certain things I have ideas of, he says, that have to have an independent existence outside of me. Or even if they don't, they can't be said to be nothing. Although in a sense I think them at will, nevertheless, they are not something I have fabricated. Rather, they have their own true and immutable natures. He's going to give us an example of what he's talking about here. So there's some ideas that even though I'm able to come up with these ideas, he's going to talk about a triangle. I can think of a triangle at will if I want to. But even though I can think of a triangle at will, what a triangle is and the properties that a triangle has do not depend on my will. Those are things I cannot fabricate. So again, let me reread that line. He says, although in a sense I think these ideas at will, nevertheless, for some reason I can't say nevertheless this morning. Nevertheless, they are not something I have fabricated. Rather, they have their own true and immutable, unchangeable, you can't change what it is, immutable natures. For example, when I imagine a triangle, even if perhaps no such figure exists outside my thought anywhere in the world, and never has. So maybe there are no triangles out there. Maybe triangles are just in my mind. Descartes doesn't quite believe that exactly, but he's just entertaining that possibility. But even if that were so, he says, right, even if there were no triangles in nature, there would still be things that are true of the triangle, right? Let me start over again, right? Even if perhaps no such figure exists, no such triangle exists outside my thought, anywhere in the world, never has, the triangle still has a certain determinate nature, a certain essence or form, which is unchangeable and eternal, which I did not fabricate, and which does not depend on my mind. This is evident from the fact that various properties can be demonstrated regarding this triangle. And Descartes loved to do this. If you ever take a class in trigonometry or pre-calculus, probably 70 or 80% of what you're learning is stuff that he himself, Descartes, you can thank him for figuring it out, But how we analyze triangles, trigonometry, basically, he's responsible for a lot of these discoveries. But basic properties that even go back to Pythagoras, the Pythagorean theorem, and the fact that all the angles add up to 180 degrees and such things. These are things that don't depend upon me just making up a shape in my head. Once I understand what a three-sided figure is, whether I call it a triangle or any other name I give it, it has certain properties that don't depend on me. They depend on the nature of space itself and the nature of shapes, the shapes themselves. It's evident that the various properties can be demonstrated regarding this property, namely that it has three angles that are equal to two right angles, that its longest side is opposite its largest angle, right? Can you imagine a triangle, picture a triangle in your head where the largest side is not opposite the largest angle? That would make sense. Oh no, so the largest side is opposite the smallest? That doesn't make any sense. You can't picture that in your head. That is an absurd idea. Impossible. Impossible, what Descartes would say. Um, these are properties I now clearly acknowledge whether I want to or not, even if I previously had given them no thought whatever when I imagined the triangle. For this reason, then, they were not fabricated by me. Okay, so all these things that are true, he established earlier on in this essay that his thoughts are real. They might not be of real things, but he's having the thoughts. So we may be thinking of a purple dinosaur or a yellow rhinoceros or something. I've just made that up. And no such thing exists in the world, but the thought exists in our head. So thoughts exist, and my decisions exist. What he calls my will, that exists, whether it's a good or bad decision. It's only judgments that can be true or false. But when I think about things like geometrical shapes, now we have some other things that are not dependent on me that are actually true, right? The thoughts that are true depend on me. The will the decisions I make depend on me, Descartes going to say. But whether or not a triangle has two right angles, all the angles inside add up to 180, that doesn't depend on me. That just is. So there's some things that are true external to me and my nature as a thinking thing. It is irrelevant for me. I'm just continuing right where I left off. It is irrelevant for me to say that perhaps the idea of a triangle came to me from external things through the sense organs, because of course I have on occasion seen triangle-shaped bodies. For I can think of countless other figures concerning which there can be no suspicion of their ever having entered me through the senses. And yet I can demonstrate various properties of these figures no less than I can those of the triangle. So he thinks that the truth of triangles is not a truth that I gathered from my senses. Again, he's hardcore rationalist here. And his proof for this, I don't think is that convincing unless he would give a good example, which he doesn't until later on. And maybe the example actually is a pretty good example. It is a good example. But here he just sort of says, there are other ideas. He doesn't mention what they are. He says there are other ideas that I can demonstrate truths about, just like I demonstrate truths about the triangle. And there's no way I've seen them through my senses. And you're thinking, okay, like for instance, he doesn't give you the for instance. But I'll tell you, he mentions a shape in Meditation 6 in a different context too, which is kind of weird. He mentions a shape. I don't even remember what it's called. I think it's a chiliagon, Chileagon or something. I might get the name wrong, but anyways, it's a 100-sided shape. That's what that is. A shape that has 100 sides. And so let's say there is actually a 100 shaped thing in the world. I would imagine, try to imagine close your eyes and imagine a 100, or did I say 1,000? I think it's a 100 sided shape. Like I'm just picturing a bunch of, it's looks like a circle with a bunch of just small little ridges, almost like a bottle cap with just a bunch of little tiny ridges around it. I'm not actually picturing 100 distinct sides at the same time. And yet a mathematician, a geometer could tell you all these properties that such a figure would have. How many triangles you could divide it into, how you would figure out the area of such a shape. There are things that are true about this thing, even though you've never seen such a thing. So truth, or the essence of geometrical shapes, are not dependent upon me and what I just imagine, my imagination, and they're not necessarily something we arrived at through our senses. In fact, they couldn't have come from our senses, insists Descartes. Yeah, so again, I think of other figures concerning which they've never entered through the senses, but I can demonstrate things about them. All these properties are patently true because I know them clearly, and thus they are something and not merely nothing. For it's obvious that whatever is true is something. And I've already demonstrated at some length that all that I clearly know is true. And I don't know if I want to get too much into this yet, but we're probably, I might save this for the next lecture, or I might just wait till the end until we get to meditation 6. But that last line I just read, all that I know clearly must be true. This is something I've been kind of ignoring, I think. Might have sort of alluded to this a bit throughout these lectures, but I haven't focused on it. Descartes has this idea in his head that anything he knows clearly and distinctly, clear, distinct ideas, must be true, cannot be denied. Bedrock, foundational knowledge, all other knowledge can be based on clear, distinct ideas. This kind of comes back to bite him in the ass. Again, I'll tell you later, but for now we should probably just move on because he's going to jump from this contemplation of the nature, or essence, I should say, the essence of material things, the geometrical truth of things that he contemplates. And he very quickly segues to this new proof for God's existence. Because he starts to think about, okay, wait a minute. Now that I think about the nature of a triangle or the nature of a square, I come to realize that there are things that are true about squares. There are things that are true about triangles that I can't help but acknowledge once I understand the nature of these shapes. And there's something also about other ideas. There's certain ideas, like later on he mentions, you can't imagine a mountain without a valley. You can't imagine water without wetness, fire without heat. That there's something essential about certain concepts. And this leads him to his final proof that he's going to offer in this essay for the existence of a divine being. He's going to make the case that just like you can't imagine a triangle where the largest angle isn't opposite the largest side, or a triangle where, the interior angles don't add up to two right angles. Just like that's impossible to try to imagine a triangle that, doesn't have the properties a triangle has. He thinks that the same thing applies to God, that there are certain properties that if you remove these properties from the concept of God, then you no longer have the concept of God. Just like if you remove three sides, it's no longer a triangle. It's, some other shape. If it's four sides, square, rectangular, whatever. So Descartes says that, you can say things like perfection. If you take away perfection from the concept of God, that's not God. If you take away the concept of omnipotence or omniscience, being all powerful, all knowing, take away any of those qualities, and that's like having a mountain without a valley, you see. And so how does this get to a proof for God's existence? Well, he wants to claim that one of the properties that God must necessarily have is existence itself. That it is incompatible with the nature of a divine being to not exist. Just like it's incompatible of the nature of a triangle to have more than three sides. If it has more or less than three sides, it's no longer a triangle. It's no longer the thing that you're talking about when you're talking about triangles. He wants to say the same thing about God. So God has all these qualities, again, perfection, existence is one of them. That you can't think about God without thinking about existence. Existence is essential to the notion of God. this seems like a pretty weak argument, I gotta say, especially the way I explained it. Maybe I can do it a little bit better. Let me try to do it better. This argument, by the way, and I've got it sort of written down here. Maybe some of y'all are convinced by it, but I mean, I'm listening to myself and I'm like, man, I'm kind of making this sound lame. This argument actually has quite a precedent to it. It goes way back to a much earlier time, medieval period, centuries before Descartes, to Saint Anselm, and it's known in the literature as the ontological argument. Ontological, having to do with being. Ontology is the study of being. So ontological is having to do with being. So the ontological argument has to do with the being of God, God's being. And the way that Descartes is presenting it here, you can kind of break it down to this sort of this two premised argument with the conclusion that God exists. The first premise is basically the assertion that God is the perfect being. God is perfect. God has all the qualities that are necessary in order to be perfect. One of those qualities is existence. In other words, and this is the second premise, in order to be perfect, that implies that one exists. If one doesn't exist, one cannot be perfect. Now, don't let this confuse you. Some people are like, well, wait a minute. He's saying that if you exist, you're perfect? No. You got it backwards. He's saying that in order to be perfect, you have to exist. Obviously, there are things that exist that aren't perfect. I exist. I believe I exist, right? According to Descartes, if I think therefore I must be. I think, therefore I am. So here I am existing. Am I perfect? Pretty close, I suppose. But definitely, I make mistakes sometimes. I forget to use the comma in the right place or carry the one when I'm doing long division. Sure, I make mistakes. And I exist. So no, he's not saying existence is perfect always. He's saying, no, if you're going to be perfect, you can't really be anything if you don't exist. So at the very least, to be perfect, you must exist. So therefore, God has to exist. Now, like I said, this is an older argument. It goes way back, centuries to Saint Anselm. I think he's writing this in the 1200s. And even Saint Anselm didn't get much love for this argument from his own brethren, right? From his own fellow religious, theologically minded friends. They were against this. They would taunt him. They'd said, "Oh, if something's perfect, it must exist." Well, I'm thinking of a perfect island. There's a perfect island in the middle of the ocean that's perfect, and everything's perfect there. It's a Garden of Eden island. Well, it must exist or it couldn't be perfect. So therefore there's a perfect island in the middle of the ocean where there's perfect food and trees and, plant life, and it's Garden of Eden, and he's like, well, no. You misunderstand it. This only works for God. God is the only concept like this because God is the only being that truly is perfect. Now, to be fair to Anselm, maybe I should explain, and this way of explaining the argument may be more convincing, but let me explain his presentation of the ontological argument. The way that he begins the argument is he just starts making all these observations about what you might call levels of intensity. He says, there are certain parts of the world that are colder than others. There are certain parts of the world that are warmer and hotter than others. And he imagines, well, there must be a point in the universe that's like the hottest place in the entire universe. And there must be a place in the universe that's like the coldest place in the universe. So there's all these gradations. And so he says, so there must be, somebody in the world who's like the strongest person, like the most muscular, strongest, can lift the heaviest weight, the strongest human. And there must be like the fastest dog, or, there's always the best of something, somewhere in the universe. And so St. Anselm says, okay, so let's apply this logic writ large. There must be something in the universe, some being that exists that is the greatest being in the universe, just the greatest being that there is. And he says, well, wait a minute. If that being didn't exist, it wouldn't be the greatest being. So therefore, there must be such a thing. There must be some being such that no other being exists that is greater than that being. Now, the problem I find with this argument is, what does it mean to be the greatest being? I kind of understand what it means to be the strongest person, like strength can, like physical strength, maybe like strong mental strength. That's maybe a little bit more vague. That's something maybe hard to measure. But if you're talking like just brute physical strength, like you could test that. Maybe you could like make some people lift weights and stuff and test their muscle fibers for how many muscle fibers they had per square inch or something. There are physical tests for that. But to just talk about a thing, a being that is the best thing, like what does that even mean? Best at what? Oh, best at everything. Like, okay, like best cook? Like God is the best cook? The best cleaner? The best deceiver? Is he really good at deceiving people? You see where this goes. You see what the word best or greatest, it kind of requires a context. Greatest at what? Greatest, so the word perfection is kind of vague to me. Perfect in what sense, right? That was the perfect meal. What that means, it was perfect for me. It was just enough food, not too much, not too little. Or maybe I meant perfect in the way it was flavored. Not too much salt, not too little. You see, these are very vague terms. They require, to me, they require a context. So yeah, I'm not. Another way you might attack this argument that I find somewhat effective. Just imagine that yourself. I know a lot of my students are probably believers. They believe in God, but just try to imagine that you aren't. Right? Imagine that you are a skeptic, right? And someone's trying to prove God exists to you. And they're like, I can prove it. You don't believe God exists. You're an atheist. They find out you're an atheist, and they want to convince you. You might not even let them get past the first two words here, because the first premise is making all these assertions. God is, wait a minute, you haven't even proved the conclusion yet. You haven't even proved that this capital G God exists. So how can you say anything about this being? God is perfect. God is all-knowing. God is this. God. What do you mean? This is just an abstract concept at this point. How can you assert anything about something you haven't even proven the existence of yet? So some wouldn't even let you get past the first premise. But personally, I think that the concept of perfection itself very vague. The way Anselm words it, I forget the exact wording. I'm probably butchering it, but the paraphrasing it, the essential point: that which nothing else greater can be imagined, that which nothing else greater can be. This is just a vague concept. It's not a very well-defined concept, and it might not even refer to anything. The word "great" to me, I don't want to say it's completely relative. I'm not saying that obviously there is an objective measure for strongest in the physical sense. You can measure it by several vectors, but great in a general sense, or the best at everything, to me is just a kind of for lack of a better word, nonsensical term. Well, we're actually ready to move on to meditation 6, unless anybody has any questions or comments. But that's the final proof we get for God's existence. Now Descartes finally is going to he's finally going to get us to the existence of the external world, which honestly, once you see his argument for the existence of external objects, you're kind of like, why didn't you just say that earlier? It seems like you could have given us this argument 2 or 3 or 4 meditations back. I think I mentioned that already. Some of you might sort of So I guess we got a few options here, and maybe some of you already can maybe piece this together if you think about what he said already. So the problem that we're dealing with, well, there's a lot of problems he's dealing with in Meditation 6, but the problem I'm referring to now is I've got this experience, in the thought bubble here. I'm assuming I'm seeing a tree out there. I'm assuming there's a tree out there. I'm assuming there's an object. Rays of light are bouncing off of it. Those rays of light are entering into my optic nerve, hitting my mind, right? Interpreting all that data, and I'm having this experience. There's a thing out there causing me to see it. Well, okay. At this point, Descartes is entertaining all these different hypotheses. He wants to believe that one. He wants to believe, look, there's a thing out there that's causing me to see it. What are the alternatives? Well, the alternatives are that I'm causing my own experience. There is no out there. There is no object out there. It's all in my mind. He's going to reject that one. But the other alternative is that God is causing all my experiences. There is no out there. There are no objects external from my thoughts. There's no external world. There's no material things. There are no corporeal substances. It's all in my mind. And God is causing it. All my experiences are being presented to me moment by moment by God. So those are the three hypotheses he lays out. The first one is sort of the common sense one, which he eventually gets to. Yeah, there are things out there, they exist, and they cause me to see them when I look at them with my senses. Right? Second, I cause my experience. It's all in my head, and I'm the cause of it. Third one, God causes it. Why does he reject 2 and 3? Why does he reject the second and the third and go with the first? What would his argument be? Does anybody have any clues why he would do this? I guess we could just read it, but it starts on page, let me find the paragraph. If you look on page 51, actually, sorry, 52, page 52, about a third of the way down. Again, if you have a different edition, look for the 79 in the margins, and it's about 5 or 6 lines below that. Descartes says, now there clearly is in me a passive faculty of sensing. That is, a faculty for receiving and knowing the ideas of sensible things. But I could not use it unless there also existed either in me or in something else a certain active faculty of producing or bringing about these ideas. Okay, so there's a passive faculty in me of receiving the experiences, but I didn't tell myself, see a freaking a tree out there. I just looked and I saw the tree. So that's passive. But something must be causing it. There must be an active element. There must be something that caused the experience to happen. There must be an active faculty of producing or bringing about these ideas. So that the question is, what is the active faculty? Is it a physical thing out there? Yes, it is, says Descartes, but he can't prove that yet, he says. Or is it something else? Is it in me? Am I causing it? He says, no, this faculty surely cannot be in me, since it clearly presupposes no active understanding. And these ideas are produced without my cooperation and often even against my will. Therefore, the only alternative is that it is in some substance different from me, containing either formally or immanently all the reality that exists objectively in the ideas produced by that faculty, as I have just noted above. So in other words, the idea that I'm having of the tree is caused by something that has similar qualities to the idea, and has those qualities formally, immanently, and where I have them in my mind objectively, as he puts it, right? These ideas are produced without my cooperation and often against my will. Therefore, the only alternative is that it is in some substance different from me, containing formally or immanently all the causes that exist objectively in the ideas produced by the faculty, as I just noted above. Hence, this substance is either a body, that is, a corporeal nature, which contains formally all that is contained objectively in the ideas, or else it is God or some other creature more noble than a body, which contains eminently all that is contained objectively in the ideas. Okay, so either there's something out there, I couldn't have caused this stuff because I have no control over it. This contradicts something he said earlier in the earlier meditations. Does anybody remember? He's bringing up this question, I think it's in meditation 3, before he gets to God, the proof for God's existence. And he says something like, I couldn't be the cause of these ideas because I see a desk whether I want to or not. I see a tree whether I want to or not. But then he says, oh, well, wait a minute. Sometimes I have dreams and I see stuff and I'm not controlling it. And I'm obviously, my mind, it's in my mind, and my mind is causing me to see a dream. So maybe I am causing my own reality. I don't even know it. I'm just not even aware of it. Maybe there's some faculty that's in me that's unknown to me. You know, what psychologists might call a subconscious, or unconscious faculty in your mind that causes your experience and your ideas to happen. And your body, your mind. I don't want to say body, because especially when we're using it, your mind produces your experience without you even knowing it, because there's parts of your mind that you don't have access to or something like that. He kind of seems to forget that possibility here, and he says, oh, no, I can't be the cause of my experience because I didn't cause myself to see a tree. I just saw a tree because I looked over there. Don't you remember your early argument against that way of thinking? Well, then he says, well, wait a minute. Maybe God is causing all this stuff. Maybe there really isn't a thing out there. Maybe God is causing all this stuff. He rejects that idea too. He does believe, remember, he does believe that God is the creator. So he does believe that God created the universe, but he doesn't believe that God is constantly causing his experience of things, that everything that happens is just a movie in his mind that God is animating for him. He thinks that no, there's a real physical world out there, and my mind has access to it through my senses. And I can use my mind to sort of push away all the misjudgments that my senses are prone to and get at the truth of what's really going on. So how does he discount the other hypothesis? He sort of rejected, well, it can't be coming from me. Why is it not coming? Why aren't all my images in my mind coming from God? Why is not all my experience coming from God directly? Well, he says, because that would be really deceptive, wouldn't it? Don't we all naturally believe that the world exists out there? It's not natural to doubt everything. Most people, when you're a child, when you're growing up, you don't go around thinking, maybe this is all a dream. Maybe I'm going to wake up and there'll be the real life. Maybe if I try to grab this desk, it'll disappear because it's just that no, you think it's real. You have this natural compulsion to believe that something is actually existing independent of you, that there's an actual object out there. So I guess Descartes is saying, look, if God designed you and God created you and God gave you this instinct to believe in physical bodies, to believe in your own body, to believe in the world out there, if he gave you that instinct and yet it's all a lie and really everything's just in your head, God's just animating all your experiences and it's all God's movie in your brain, that would be a deception. That would be you would be constantly deceived by a divine being, and that's not a good thing. So Descartes already argued earlier that deception is incompatible with God. So the only hypothesis that remains is the common sense one. This experience of the tree corresponds to something out there. There actually is a tree. Yay, there are trees exist, right? Because otherwise it comes from me, and no, I couldn't cause it, because obviously it's there whether I want to see it or not. And it couldn't have come from God in the sense that he's talking here, because that would be deceptive as well. So there is a world out there of physical stuff, and my senses have a sort of, limited access to the physical world. Obviously, we have to put a big caveat on that. Remember, Descartes is a rationalist, so our senses aren't absolutely reliable. We have to go with our reason and our understanding. He says, since God is not a deceiver, it is patently obvious that he does not send me these ideas either immediately by himself or even through the mediation of some creature that contains the objective reality of these ideas, not formally but immanently. For since God has given me no faculty whatsoever for making this determination, but instead has given me a great inclination to believe that these ideas issue from corporeal things, right? So God has created me and given me an inclination to believe that these, I hate that he uses the word idea. I prefer the word experience or thoughts or impressions even. That's a word that David Hume uses, impressions. I have an impression of an object out there, right? I look across the street and I see that house over there, or I see the car driving by. He's calling that an idea. Okay, so there must be an actual thing that these ideas that I have of the thing issue from. Okay, there must be an actual object out there. God makes me think this. God gives me an instinct to believe it. So it would be deception if it weren't true. So therefore it must be true in some sense. I fail to see how God could be understood not to be a deceiver if these ideas were to issue from a source other than corporeal things, other than physical bodies. And consequently, corporeal things exist. All right, yay, physical things exist, right? We finally get, meditation 6, and we finally know that material things exist, physical stuff exists. Up to this point, all we knew was that thought exists and God exists. But now we know that the desk that I'm sitting in front of exists, and my body exists. Oh, geez, now I can breathe. Now I can sleep easy at night. Thank you, Descartes. But again, I'm kind of frustrated because I feel like he could have quickly whipped out this argument really quick at the beginning of Meditation 4. Once he showed that God is not a deceiver, this argument, it took him like a paragraph and a half. He could have whipped it out, and I would have been able to sleep easier at night before I finished reading all 6 meditations. But anyways, we've got about 15 or 20 minutes left, and I'm contemplating whether or not I want to get into Descartes' distinction between the mind and the body. Now he's proven that the body exists. The body's not an illusion. I actually have a body. There are other bodies besides mine that exist as well. And so, if you look at the title here of the 6th meditation concerning the existence of material things and the distinction between the mind and body, the real distinction between the mind and body, this is what we're going to turn to next. We've dealt with material things. Now we're going to focus on the primary material things, the primary material things with regards to our own interest, and that's our own personal space, our body. And he's going to talk about the relationship between the mind, the thought, which is non-physical, and the physical, the non-corporeal, the non-bodily, the thought, the mind, the soul, whatever you want to call it, the self, and the physical. And this, I don't know what you'd call it, this explanation, this account of the interaction between the mind and the body and the distinction between them, this is oftentimes seen as Descartes' biggest weak spot. I don't know if it's his biggest weak spot, but it is kind of a weak spot. And, you know, the more I think about it, the more I talk about it, the more I'm pretty confident we should probably leave this for next lecture. So I'm going to deal on Thursday at 1 p.m. I'm going to deal with what's called the mind-body problem and how it relates to this reading from Descartes, and we'll talk a bit about his theory of the mind and the body and the interaction between the two. But we've got, like I said, about 20 minutes left. I'm going to let us go a bit early, but I'm going to try to keep this really brief. I do want to address what I mentioned earlier, this notion of clear and distinct ideas. Let me see if I have a slide here that has the term clear, distinct ideas. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So, and maybe I can find one of these passages where he kind of trips himself up. I mentioned earlier, I already talked about what he says about clear and distinct ideas. He says, if I know something clearly, in other words, it's not some fuzzy notion, you know, like he thinks that the concept of thought is a clear idea. The cogito is a clear idea. The thinking thing, I'm a thinking thing. Because I think and because I'm a thing, I just know what that means, right? I might not even have language before I even know the word thing, before I know the word thought. I'm having thoughts, and I am a thing, and I know that this thing is different from that thing. So he thinks those are examples of things that are clear. It's clear what we mean by a thing. Is it really? And it's distinct. It is distinct. In other words, it's not easily confused or mingling with other ideas. It's its own ideas. So I suppose the idea of male or man is not really distinct because both of those things seem to refer to the same thing or something. There's overlap. They seem to mean the same thing. They're not their own idea, whatever, right? But he thinks that if something is its own idea, God is another thing. Right? There's no other concept that's a perfect, divine, eternal being. And it's understood what we mean by that, so it's clear. Descartes, at the very early parts of the meditations, I want to say it's at the very beginning of meditation 3. I could be wrong. It might be the end of meditation 2. This is right after he's established his first principle. I don't even know if I want to call it a principle, but kind of his starting point as far as ideas, things he's certain of. Once he knows his own existence is undeniable. Once he's established the truth of the cogito, the thinking thing, he pauses for a minute because he's like, wow, okay, this is one thing I can never doubt. I think, therefore I am. Even if there's an evil genius deceiving me, at least I'm here to be deceived. Everything else could be false, but my existence could never, ever be denied. And then he's like, wow, cool. So I've got something to start with. It may not be much, but it's something to start with. And he pauses for a minute. He says, well, why am I so certain of it? What is it about the cogito, the thinking thing, that makes it so certain? And he arrives at this notion, this formulation of it being clear and distinct. He's like, well, it's known clearly and it's known distinctly. That's something about it. So it must be the case that clear and distinct ideas are always true. So I can always be assured that if I know something clearly and distinctly, it must be true. And then he pauses again and he's like, well, wait a minute. Maybe that's not a good criteria. Maybe that's not a good standard, because maybe I'm tricking myself, or the evil genius is tricking me into thinking it's a good standard. And maybe the evil genius is making me think that clear, distinct ideas are true when they're really not. So I've got to prove that God exists. And then I know that clear, distinct ideas are always good. Okay? So he knows the cogito is true. Why does he know it's true? Because it's a clear and a distinct idea. Oh, wait. Maybe the evil genius is making him think clear, distinct is true, and it's not. Gotta prove that God exists so that clear and distinct ideas are true, okay? Well, here's where the problem arises. When we get to meditation 5, which we just finished, he seems to use a clear and distinct idea of God to prove the existence of God. This is known as the Cartesian Circle. Basically, in order to prove that God exists, he has to have a clear and distinct idea of God. But in order to prove that clear and distinct ideas are reliable, he has to prove God's existence. Okay? So, again, this is a circle. I think I'm really explaining it horribly now that it's hard to follow, I admit. But the idea is, again, in order for clear, distinct ideas to be true, God has to exist. In order for God to exist, clear and distinct ideas have to be true, or at least the clear and distinct idea of God has to exist. So he needs God to support clear and distinct ideas, and he needs clear and distinct ideas to support God. This, again, is known as the Cartesian Circle. I think there's actually a Wikipedia page on it. So if you're completely like, what the hell is Professor Ross talking about? I'm lost. Probably Wikipedia will help you out here, right? But this is a contradiction in his thinking, which he doesn't seem to sort of find. I was looking for a page number. There's a quote here where it's kind of obvious what he's doing. On 51, this is kind of where I don't know if this is really the right quote, but he's mentioning God. He's mentioning clear and distinct ideas. So what the heck? Let me read it here. This is page 51, lines, under the 78 in the column. She says, first, I know that all things that I clearly and distinctly understand can be made by God as I understand them. For this reason, my ability clearly and distinctly to understand one thing without another suffices me to make certain that the one thing is different from the other, since they can be separated from each other at least by God. That was not at all what I was looking for. Let me see if I can find the passage. I want to end class on this quote. Maybe I need to go back further. Yes, I do. I need to go back to meditation 6. This makes sense too, because this is right after he's given us that new proof for God's existence, what we were calling the ontological proof for God's existence. He says at the bottom of 46, he says, once I perceived that there is a God, and also understood at the same time that everything else depends on him, and that he's not a deceiver, I then concluded that everything that I clearly and distinctly perceive is necessarily true. Again, so I prove God exists, therefore everything I know clearly, distinctly must be true. But wait a minute, you used a clear, distinct idea of God to prove God's existence. He says, even if I no longer attend to the reasons leading me to judge that this is true, so long as I merely recall that I clearly and distinctly observe it, no counter-argument can be brought forward that might force me to doubt it. On the contrary, I have a clear and certain knowledge of it, a true and certain knowledge of it. Again, the Cartesian Circle. I feel like maybe it was because I was I'm so antsy to get through Descartes today. I feel like I did a horrible job. Maybe it's just because nobody interacted today. I feel like nobody asked me any questions or said anything. So that also, maybe that hurt my ego somewhat. But I feel like I did a really crummy job rushing through Meditations 5 and 6. I was just so antsy to get through with Descartes. But we kind of did. We pretty much did. Like I mentioned earlier, all we have left to cover as far as this reading is concerned is a brief account of Descartes' theory of the mind and the body and how they interact with each other. And what we'll also do on Thursday, if you can make it to the 1 p.m. meeting, what we're going to do on Thursday is we'll talk about some other approaches to the same questions that Descartes is asking here. How do you bridge the gap between your experience of the world, right? Like I have this experience of the tree. How do I know that my experience is anything like the actual world out there, the physical world, the reality that we all are sort of immersed in. How these different philosophers approach it, we're going to sort of see that next meeting. I'm not going to cover them super in depth, but we need to look at some other perspectives besides Descartes, because I feel like we really just got mostly a rationalist perspective. We are going to talk about a couple other rationalists, namely Spinoza and Leibniz, more on them later. But I want to mention some empiricists. We'll probably focus mainly on David Hume, but I'll also talk about John Locke and George Berkeley, and we'll look at how they try to resolve some of these philosophical problems. Or sometimes they just straight up avoid them. You're going to see that they don't like the way that Descartes is even framing the questions, and so they'll critique that. But that's all for next time. I guess I should just go ahead and stop there. This is a good place to stop the meeting, and I'm going to stop recording now.